Welcome to Decision Makers. I'm Charles Ellison, your executive producer, also host of this program. We do this in partnership with Council of State Governments, also Learn for Life and the Smart Surfaces Coalition. Joining us now is Vermont General Assembly Representative Brian Cina. He represents Chittenden 15, that's the district there in Vermont. And he's joining us here on Decision Makers this week. How are you doing, Representative? Good to have you.
I'm good. How are you today?
All right, good, good. For more on the Vermont General Assembly, the Vermont State Legislature, you can go to legislature.vermont.gov. So talk to us, Representative, about your priorities right now as a legislator in a state like Vermont. We don't talk much about Vermont, one of the smaller states, but a lot going on there. And what are your constituents' priorities right now?
It's a big question because I think that there are many priorities of my constituents, and I don't have a homogenous constituency. There's a wide range of people with different demographics in this district. So Chittenden 15 is a piece of the city of Burlington. It's most of Ward 1 or the East District of the city, and then part of the Old North End, and that's the part of the district I live in. And so like in the Old North End, there's over 70 languages spoken. It's where many immigrants have settled over the last 200 years. And most recently, a lot of new Americans from Somalia, the Congo, Iraq, Nepal, Burma, there's so people coming from all over the world to this neighborhood. It's also the Old North End also has one of the, I would say, it has a wide range of socioeconomic backgrounds in it. But then as you go up the hill towards the university, you have people with more money. I think that's the simplest way to put it. So there's a mix in this district. So sometimes the interests of one group of constituents might conflict with interests of others. For example, if we're debating raising taxes on people of high income, the majority of my constituents may not be affected by that, but some of them would. So it's hard to say what their priorities are as a whole, because sometimes there's differences. But if I focus on the areas where I think there's agreement, I would say that in this district, that equity is important. And there's a long history in the Old North End of activism. And so over the last 8 years that I've been a representative, one of the priorities has been racial justice. And I've worked with various groups in Burlington and across the state on policy issues. At the edge of our district, so it's right. I think it's across the street technically of the border is now what the Richard Kemp Center, which is the Black Community Center that we have, or African Americans descended from slavery, I believe is the term we used. So that there's a priority for my constituents has been social justice and racial justice issues. I think healthcare is important to people in this district. And I might be biased because I'm a healthcare provider, but we do have within the boundaries of this district, we have a significant portion of the University of Vermont, including the medical school and the Department of Social Work, where I got my graduate degree. We have the hospital in this district, University of Vermont Medical Center, the biggest hospital in Vermont. And a lot of healthcare providers live in this district. There's a lot of nurses and doctors and social workers and social service providers who live in this district. So I think healthcare is an important issue. And I'll pick one more to throw out there. I think that environmental justice and climate action has been a priority for most, if not all, of my constituents over the last 8 years, and people have been demanding that we take more action to address the ecological crises we're facing. So I could go on, but those are 3 things that come to mind in the last 8 years that that have risen up as a priority amongst my constituents, and they're areas where I've done work on their behalf. So,
Throughout these conversations here on Decision Makers, Representative, we use this term equitable governance, right? And so, we explore how how legislators achieve equitable governance. And so we got a sense of your priorities as a legislator, particularly as you represent a very diverse district, diverse constituencies,
yeah.
right? And have a myriad of issues that they'd like addressed and a myriad of challenges as well. But I'm sure that your priorities and also the challenges, the issues that your diverse constituencies bring up, sometimes they may clash, right, with the priorities of the legislature. How does the legislature address those types of issues? How does the legislature, or how do you push the legislature to achieve more equitable governance?
Yeah, it's a big question. We could probably do like a interview on that alone. So to be honest with you, it's been rough
Yeah.
for me being in the legislature, because the culture of, and I don't, I haven't served in any other state governments, but my guess is there's going to be some common struggle across bodies because of the nature of this representative democracy and the history from which it's risen, where it was a representative democracy for some, not all. And then over time, we have expanded access to that democracy and in Vermont made it easier for people to vote as well. Like, we've shortened the requirement for registering. Everyone gets an absentee ballot mailed to their house. And then of course we were, the opponents of that were accusing people of, what they call it, vote harvesting, and making up these conspiracies that somehow people are going to come steal them and use them. But that isn't what's happening. What we're seeing is people who have been disenfranchised, or who have barriers to getting to a poll, elders, people with disabilities, people with anxiety, people who work 3 jobs, they're able to vote more easily now. And so I share that as an example of how in Vermont and across the United States that there has been an increase in inclusion in our democracy. But that being said, as we have expanded access, there's also backlash to that, because the way that it has been structured has provided greater power to people with wealth, I think, historically. And so when we talk about equitable access to government, I have seen many problems with people who have been historically disenfranchised being included in the decision-making process of government. I can give you a recent example if it's helpful that connects with, because I think it being more specific, I can give you many examples, but I'll give you a recent one, and it ties into the priorities of constituents, because there is strong support in my district for taking steps away from incarceration and towards alternatives. And that has been a priority for me for the whole 8 years. And in the last 2 years, I realized that we don't need incarceration. I always thought we would need some form of incarceration and look to Norway as a model. But then I met 2 years ago an advocate from Free Her Vermont, which is a prison abolition campaign sponsored by the National Council of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. It's a long name. I wanted to get it right. So they have successfully bent the trajectory of corrections policy and the use of incarceration in various states. And in Vermont, they started this campaign, and they reached out to me and said, you have a record of working on this issue. Would you work with us? And when I met with them, they asked me if I would put a bill in to have a moratorium on new prisons. And I said I was open to that. But I would do it only if we also proposed a solution, because during the Black Lives Matter movement, which after I visited the African American History Museum recently, and I believe that's where I heard that is probably the largest civil rights movement yet. That the Black Lives Matter movement, the amount of people who participated exceeded previous civil rights movements in the United States. So coming out of that, we heard calls to defund the police and come up with alternative responses to public safety, but there were not solutions locally here in the city of Burlington or in the state of Vermont that were articulated and broadcast more than the public relations efforts of the police departments. And so the message ended up sort of landing with the public was cut funding for the police, eliminate the police, let people, do what they want, have there be no accountability, that kind of thing. And I think our police department had over 100 press releases saying we don't have enough police, and then crime went up, and now we have a governor who's saying it's because of anti-policing policies, and he's ignoring the impact that the pandemic and other challenges in our society have had on social determinants of health, which I believe is what's driving increased crime, as well as policy that criminalizes behavior of people who are struggling with substance use disorder, or who are living in poverty, or who are unhoused. So that being said, I said to Free Her, I'm happy to do this, but we need to clearly articulate from the beginning a solution. And so I think I'm giving you a little more detail than I meant, but I'm getting to the point about equitable access to government, because when we came forward with ideas around alternatives to incarceration and how to make a just transition from incarceration to what we call community care, where we hold people accountable who cause harm or break the law and commit a crime, but we do it in a way that maximizes recovery, rehabilitation, redemption. We don't react with further punishment and stigma, which drives addiction and drives people to cause harm to others. And in our organizing efforts, we continue to face obstacles that are rather appalling to me. For example, we have advocated all along that people with lived experience should be given time for testimony. We had to fight to get time in the legislature for testimony, and had women who had been incarcerated, a doctor who worked in correctional facilities, family members take time off of work, come to the legislature, and then on the spot be told that they weren't welcome to testify and only I could speak. And they were sitting in the room. And I said, well, there was a miscommunication. I was told they could come, and and no one told me they couldn't come. They're here. But the leadership structure was rigid. They said no. But I have been in rooms where an insurance company lobbyist comes in and the committee chair will just let them answer a question. So why is it that if a lobbyist for a highly paid lobbyist for a corporation comes in, there'll be an exception, but when a constituent who has lived experience on an issue is in the room, we don't? And there was a miscommunication that they were invited by one person, but I guess they didn't talk to the other. It's not like they just show up. They can't even speak. That to me was a process equity issue, and it was one of many. And on all the major social justice issues I've worked on, the health equity bill, myself and the Racial Justice Alliance introduced a bill that would promote health equity and address health disparities. In the process of trying to pass that bill, we had obstacles. We had legislators cutting Black women off while they were speaking in the middle of their testimony and correcting them. And they don't do that to anyone else. And it's like, it was clear after a few meetings that people, it was implicit bias. Like, I don't think they were planning it. But that's an issue, that it makes people feel like it's not worth coming if their voice is going to be interrupted and they're not going to be heard. We had when we passed the legislation that created the Land Access and Opportunity Board, we were given 15 minutes of testimony, but a bill introduced by a white woman was given an hour a week, and it did it on the same issue. And then when myself and the coalition I worked with, Seating Power Vermont, which was a BIPOC, femme, and queer-led coalition, when we spoke up in the Social Equity Caucus of the legislature, then there was this community sort of cry for some reparations, some, action, restitution, something to make up for that. So we were then given time every week the next year. But then at the last minute, we were told there was no time to pass the bill. And there were even people in the leadership structure telling activists of color and telling labor organizers separately, it's either a labor bill or a racial justice bill. So pitting us against each other, pitting labor against racial justice. And then we had to call people in on that. And we ended up passing that as an amendment to a bill. My point is there were many obstacles on that bill. So I'm seeing it again now with our efforts to create alternatives to incarceration, that the way the system is structured, that there's so many barriers to access, and then there's gatekeepers. And even when you reduce the threshold of the barrier, if the gatekeepers aren't conscious of disparities, conscious of cultural bias, or conscious of the power dynamics, they will perpetuate these dynamics, even in a state where in general people don't accept it. So I know that was a lot, but I covered a lot of the things we worked on in that, because this issue of process equity is an ongoing problem. And luckily, with the Racial Justice Alliance, we advocated for legislation that created an Office of Racial Equity. And so we at least now have a structure in state government that's working on process equity issues, and they've been a great partner trying to navigate these difficulties and resolve conflicts.
Yes, that's fascinating how you framed that. That's another separate discussion in and of itself, right? Process equity.
Yeah.
That's something that especially legislatures, governing bodies, governing institutions deal with regularly, that we don't touch on enough. I definitely want to follow up on that. I want to follow up on that with you and with some other legislators as well. I did want to ask you about, you had raised healthcare, because you, with your experience as a healthcare provider, you had raised healthcare as a major issue, and so there have been reports of movement within the Vermont General Assembly to rekindle support for universal health care in that state. So what would implementation of single-payer health care look like in Vermont this time around if, say, that were achieved? Would it look different from, say, that single-payer plan that Governor Shumlin rejected back in 2014? How do you think Vermont could be used as a model for other states when it comes to passing something like universal health care, if that's something that you feel like you might achieve this time around?
So that's a good question. I can't say I have the exact answer to it, but I can talk about how we get there, how I envision us getting there. Because one thing I'll say as a legislator is that we introduce bills or ideas, and I've learned it's never going to be that in fact, there was one resolution with the Racial Justice Alliance that made it to the end, and then there was a problem in it that I wanted to fix, and we didn't fix it. So, you know what I mean? It was fine, but the point is that usually like a bill or an idea changes so much. So I can't say exactly what it would be, but I can tell you how I think we can get there. That we did found a universal health care caucus this year. So after 7 years of introducing bills related to universal health care, and in each of those bills, the approach we were taking was universal primary care, that we were proposing different ways of starting with primary care. The last bill for this biennium that's ending would have immediately implemented universal primary care, which would include your primary care doctor, but also outpatient therapy, I believe chiropractic. Like there was, it was more than just your primary care physician office. It was that outpatient frontline care that we know spending more money on that prevents problems down the road. But then the bill would have created a process to slowly expand that and fulfill the promise of Act 48. And Act 48 is the universal health care law you referred to earlier, which put into statute principles that we are still carrying out. So that law is still in effect. Governor Shumlin, in what we call the Great Betrayal, decided that because premiums for wealthy people were going to go up more than, the middle and low, it would have helped us, but the people at the top would be paying significantly more for their health care, that he pulled the plug on it. But the law was not repealed completely. So we are still doing pieces of it. So efforts to control cost in the healthcare system continue to move forward in Vermont and in other parts of the country due to federal policy. And I could go off on all those things, but I don't want to derail us too much. But the details are important in the long term, because if we don't bring costs down, it's hard. And two big drivers of cost are pharmaceuticals and insurance companies. And so, we continue to work on. We did create a Green Mountain Care Board with Act 48 to regulate the healthcare system in Vermont. They exist still. So these structures are in place. And what we did in the last universal primary care bill was say we were going to immediately implement universal primary care and then build on that and slowly fold in other things over 10 years. But there was disagreement in the health justice movement in Vermont. It kind of fractured after that Great Betrayal, because we had all united around this issue. And then when it didn't happen, then disagreements arose around, well, what do we do now? So there were some people who felt we can get there through Medicaid expansion. Others felt like we have to do it all at once. There's no incremental steps. Others were like, we should find incremental steps. So I realized that being divided, we would never get the goal. And so I talked to the different parties involved, and we agreed to come back together to form this Universal Healthcare Caucus, to not commit to one way, but to commit to the relationships with each other and to building community and exploring ways together. And we had 4 meetings so far. And the first meeting, we reviewed the history in Vermont and lessons learned. The second meeting, we talked about, if I mess up the order, sorry to the public, because I might mess 2 and 3 up. But the second meeting, we talked about the ideas that have been brought forward since. So like the idea of Medicaid expansion, the idea of universal primary care, for example. Then in the third meeting, we looked at how in the 10 years since Act 48, how many pieces of it we actually have implemented, and what are the remaining barriers. And in the fourth meeting, we studied or began to study and to review how Canada created a universal healthcare system. And what I learned through that process was I'm not going to give a lecture on this because it's detailed, but it started in the province of Saskatchewan. Mm-hmm. And it was started in a rural province through a coalition between the Labor Party and the Conservatives. And it's interesting because there's a Republican and myself, a progressive / Democrat, who are the co-chairs of the Universal Healthcare Caucus. So we have that existing connection here, where there's conservatives uniting with liberals and with labor. And the other key piece was that in Saskatchewan, that organized labor, not the doctors at first, but the nurses and other healthcare workers, were a driving force. So what we plan to do now is create working groups over the next 6 months, and we're going to be meeting later this month to plan all of this, to organize with the business community, to organize with labor, to do policy research and present the story of each nation, or maybe not every single one, because I think most countries have it, but some of the comparable nations, how they did it. And what we're really going to try to do is look at all that and then work with our federal delegation, with Bernie Sanders, Peter Welch, and Becca Balint, to see what can Vermont do within the existing policies of Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. What waivers could we get? What steps could we take? Because after Saskatchewan did it, the federal government of Canada was giving the provinces some leeway to explore pathways. They became a model. So similarly, if we can succeed in Vermont, there are people watching, and what works in Vermont may not work in California. But what I've learned is if Vermont and California do it both, usually the country will follow. Like if one of the largest economies in the world and one of these smallest states in the country can do it. So my hope is that that by next year we will have a bill or some proposal to bring to the legislature. And it might just be a working group or giving the Green Mountain Care Board a project, some taking further steps towards a universal system. But I do think it's going to take time, and our federal partners, it's going to matter what happens on the federal government. President Biden has done a lot with the office of president to in a political climate where there's gridlock and Congress is not taking a lot of action. President Biden has used his office to pass executive orders and sort of conduct the practices of government in ways that are helping. I'm not convinced that his opponent would be as much of an ally on it, so that could set us back. But if President Biden returns and Bernie Sanders is still the chair of healthcare, and our legislature continues to become more diverse, and there's community support here, and we're organizing labor, and healthcare workers like myself are coming out and being more engaged in the process of advocating for universal health care, I do think that we can get there. But I would say I can't tell you exactly what the path would be, because there's so many factors and there's so many voices that need to be included in that, and so many moving pieces. But what we're at least doing is we've reorganized ourselves and realized, like, the only way we're ever going to get anything is if we stick together. I think there's an African proverb, I don't remember what specific culture or tribe, that says if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that's the key, sort of a good way to summarize the strategy at this point. It's like we know it's a long-term game. So
let me also ask you about climate crisis, because you're also a member of the Vermont Climate Crisis or Climate Solutions Caucus. I was real curious about this, how the legislature up there passed the first of its kind law to hold fossil fuel companies liable for climate crisis damage. So you're now the first state to do that. And I know a lot of people out there are wondering if that will work. Is the state prepared for potential litigation on this? What's happened so far to manage the future of climate crisis in Vermont? Because I know one thing that you all are dealing with in terms of disaster, the disaster implications of climate crisis. You deal with a lot of flooding up there, flooding and wildfires in Vermont. So what's happened so far since the passage of that bill to hold oil and gas companies liable for that kind of damage and destruction?
It just passed. So nothing's happened yet, other than, like, people are worried about potential lawsuits.
Right.
If that happens, the attorney, my assumption is the attorney general of the state would defend the state, and then the courts would interpret the law and make their decision. I can't speculate on what would happen, because ultimately it's, judges have their process that's different than a legislature. They look at case law, they look at the Constitution of the federal Constitution, the state Constitution. They look at, they hear the arguments, look at the evidence. So I couldn't speculate on the outcome, and I wouldn't want to sort of add to any fear around it. Really, what it will be doing is estimating what we think the damages are, and asking them to pay for it. Whether are we going to take them to collections? I don't know. Are they going to sue us back? I don't know. My hope would be that corporations, recognize that when they've profited off of harm, that it's in not only their best interest as a business entity, but that it's in the best interest of like humanity to make reparations for the harm and try to, find a way forward that's sustainable, because the extractive economy, it goes beyond the fossil fuel industry, in terms of burning the fuels and gaseous waste, that there's plastic waste from the fossil fuel industry that, on Lake Champlain, I've seen dead birds, and they're, as they decompose, they're full of plastic. And this is in Vermont. They travel, the plastic pollution's everywhere, and birds are traveling everywhere. The microplastics issue, that, microplastics getting into our water supply worldwide. We see, a mass extinction on Earth. I think scientists say it's the 6th great extinction that we're in, I might say it wrong, but it's like the Anthropocene or something extinction. It's the only mass extinction known to humans caused by the children of the Earth, like that, a life form on Earth causing an extinction of other life forms. It's the only one we know of. There might have been ones we don't know about, because humans don't know everything, but if you look at our fossil record, there's no other evidence that another life form of Earth caused a mass extinction. It was an asteroid or some other factor. So, that's the scale and scope of ecological crisis that humanity is facing. I don't think most people really fathom it. And we have climate scientists who come visit us and talk about the impact on climate, and that alone is an existential crisis. But there's more than that, in terms of pollution and destruction of the ecosystems and the web of life on Earth. So, at some point we're destroying our own life support system. So my hope is that people will wake up, and that this would never lead to litigation, that maybe what will come out of this, at the very least, is greater consciousness of the impact of the extractive economy. That, what good is it going to be to business interests and their descendants if there's no life support system on the Earth? If their grandchildren and great grandchildren, who
there's
they
no one around to buy their product, right?
yeah, it's like,
or future products, or
yeah,
alternative products that they might create at some point.
exactly. It's not in their best interest. And so, and this is one of the problems with Western civilization is it's also a strength, is this it's sort of like the individual versus the collective, that in Western science has gotten really good at focusing in on something, and so, we're like, okay, we're looking at an organ system, we're looking at the tissue, we're looking at the cell, we're looking at the organelles, we're looking at the nucleus, we're looking at the DNA. We go further and further down. Now in science, we're acknowledging the role of quantum particles. We're going really far down. Western science is good at that. Western science has failed at recognizing that the micro in the context of the macro. Whereas like in Eastern civilizations, or indigenous, North American or South American civilizations, there's a strength in the understanding of the collective, of the whole, and of the relationships between the parts, and that, it's the sum of the parts. Both of those perspectives are useful, like knowing on the micro level, and then understanding it within the context of the macro is important. There's balance in that. And unfortunately, I think that one of the downfalls of Western civilization has been because I'm living in a colonial, I'll acknowledge I'm living in a colonial society here, that in this society, we've kind of forsaken the whole for, the part. And there's been a host of unintended consequences and damaging of relationships within the whole, because of that approach. And if it's self-destructive. and it's destroying other life. And so hopefully, you know, we can rethink our economic relationships and move from an extractive way of life to a regenerative one. But as I stay focused on it, I have hope we will get there. Unfortunately, I think we're gonna have to face loss at an unimaginable scale before we do, though.
We've been talking with Vermont State Representative Brian Cina. He represents Chittenden 15. It's a district within Vermont. It's parts of Burlington, Vermont. If you want more information on the Vermont General Assembly, you should go to legislature.vermont.gov if you want to find out more information on the Vermont General Assembly and also on Representative Cina for spending, and also we want to thank him for spending some extra time with us today here at Decision Makers. I'm Charles Ellison. I'm your executive producer and host. I want to thank our partners, the Council of State Governments, especially Eastern Region, and the Smart Services Coalition and Learn for Life for added partnership and support. Also want to thank our senior producer, Raven Robinson, and our research producer, Croy Ellison at Rutgers as well. I'm Charles Ellison. We'll see you for the next segment of Decision Makers. Go to thebnote.com for more there, to watch us there. We'll see you next time.